Now it's time to move to our next speaker, who is Jessica Runlet. She's the Special Projects and Outreach Coordinator at the State Historical Museum of Iowa, and also my cubicle neighbor. Jessica received her Bachelor of Arts degree in Politics, History, and International Business from Cornell College and her Master of Arts in Teaching from Simpson College. She's a fifth-generation Iowan, Iowa State Fair aficionado, and if you haven't been around the Iowa State Fair with Jess, really find a way to make that happen. Avid cyclist and Iowa enthusiast. Jess's love of all things history was honed on family road trips during her childhood. She never misses a historical marker and always has time to tell a story. This morning, Jess will be playing a pre-recorded video, but is here live and will answer questions at the end. So Jess, take it away.
Good morning, and welcome to the Object Photography Lightning Round here at the Preserve Iowa Summit. I wish we were in Dubuque, but learning about Dubuque the past few days has been the next best thing. My name is Jessica Runlet, and I work at the State Historical Museum of Iowa. I work as the Special Projects and Outreach Coordinator, and in this role, I have spent a significant amount of time traveling the state and photographing buildings and other historic sites. This was to create the database for the Iowa Culture mobile app, a free mobile app that I would encourage you to download to learn more about historic sites all across the state. Many of those photography skills I learned are also really relevant to object photography. So today I'm here to talk to you about photographing your collections. Photographing collections is a daunting task, but it can be easy and affordable, and that's what we'll talk about today. Doing object photography doesn't have to be fancy or complicated, and my goal is that you will leave this lightning round session knowing the tools you have that your institution could do object photography for a fairly low cost. Equipment today is better than ever, and you don't need to be a professional to take good photos. You just need to be well practiced and have a little bit of patience. So what is object photography? A few things we'll cover today is what is object photography, why you should do it, what you need for it, how do you do it, and then the great question, are there financial resources available to help pay for it? So at its simplest, object photography is creating a record of a collection. Why should you do this? You've already got the things, you've got the objects in your collection. Why do you need to take pictures of them? Turns out there are lots of reasons, and they're all very exciting, as you can tell by my choice to use so many exclamation points. Creating object photos creates a record of your collection, and it makes your collection more accessible and more open to the public. My guess is that your institution is similar to the State Historical Museum of Iowa, that you keep many artifacts in your collection in collection storage, and you don't want a whole bunch of people traipsing through collection storage to see them. So by taking photos of your objects and artifacts, you can open your collection to the public. Taking object photos also helps keep control of your database and collection. When you have pictures of things, there's no question what the artifact is, and if the item that you have is what you think it is based on the records. You should photograph objects as part of the collections process, and taking photos is also a good idea to document accessions and the condition of incoming loans. And in the same vein, object photos can also be used to document the condition of outgoing loans. An object photo collection is also an excellent resource for a communications team, and it can help increase your relevancy to community. They always say that pictures tell 1,000 words, and when you have photos of your objects, it makes it easier for you to share your objects with the community. I'll share some examples of that later. So what do you need to do object photography? I mentioned earlier that here in the year 2020, there are more resources at your fingertips than ever before. Gone are the days of shooting photos with film and then waiting for the film to be processed. Today, it's nearly instant gratification to know if your photo was good or not. The things that you will want to make sure you can take good object photos are a table, a background in gray, white, or black. This background can be many things. It could be a bed sheet, a curtain backing, solid colored fabric. But however you set up your background, you will want to make sure you set it up with a gradual curve, as that will look better in the end photos. You'll also want 2 lights in either white or daylight to help focus on your object, and a scale, or it's actually a ruler, but a visual scale for the object. And the size of that scale will depend on how big the object is that you are photographing. If you have a little tiny button that's maybe only 1 inch wide, you will want a smaller ruler or scale than if you were taking a photo of a much larger object. And since this is photography, you will need a camera or a smartphone. 20 years ago, I would have told you that you definitely wanted to avoid taking object photos with your phone because a phone is not a camera. However, we are approaching the days where a phone is a camera. A dedicated DSLR camera will probably still take better object photos as long as the person using it knows how to operate it well. But as I mentioned earlier, we are here to talk about how you can do object photography with things you already have. And if you have a fairly recent smartphone, you can do a pretty good job. My smartphone is almost 3 years old and the camera is pretty good, so I can only imagine how much better the cameras are with newer phones. If you have a lot of small or detailed items in your collection, you may want to add a macro lens. This is a bonus item because you don't necessarily need it, but if you have small items, it would be worth investing in a macro lens. Today, you can purchase lenses that snap on your smartphone. It's really incredible technology, I think. You'll also want to get a tripod. If you can put your smartphone or camera on a tripod, this will reduce camera shake and help you get better photos. Also, it should help the photographer not get fatigued in the arms because the camera will be in the same place without someone having to hold it up for days and days at a time. That tripod will help with consistency in your shots. 2 carts will also be helpful. Perhaps 1 cart to move items to the photography area and 1 cart to clean and stage items before their big moment in front of the camera. Especially if you have large items, you may also want a ladder or a step stool. The ladder and the macro lens, those you'll need to determine what you're photographing if you need them, but they are things that can help. I mentioned the macro lens is for smaller items, and the ladder or step stool definitely helps with big objects. When you have a big object, you need to get creative with your space and find a big background. But be wary of taking things outside because there are a lot of environmental dangers, like flocks of birds flying by. And with a historic item, I definitely would not want to have it blown around by the wind, and it is certainly windy in Iowa these days, it seems. So these are just some examples of equipment you may want to purchase. Many of these things could be sourced on the internet or probably available locally. You can get a tall tripod or a short tripod, depending on how big your objects are. There's multiple different kinds of lights, but you'll definitely want 2 lights to balance the light on your object. And then I also have an image of a step stool and that clip-on macro lens. This is the Humble Object Photography Station at the State Historical Museum of Iowa. And many thanks to my colleague Kay Coates, the State Historical Museum of Iowa Collections Coordinator, for sharing this image. As you can see, we have the gray background, 2 lights, and a step stool. This object photography station has sufficed for thousands of object photos and should be all the proof you need to see that it doesn't have to be fancy to work. So how do you do this object photography? One of the most interesting case studies I read was from the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Maryland. They spent 4 to 6 weeks photographing, 4 to 6 months photographing about 1,000 artifacts, taking photos 2 days a week, 10 to 50 objects per day. I share that number because I think it's important to understand that this is not necessarily a fast process. You will want to organize your project, think about what you need to photograph, how many objects can be photographed per day, and follow good museum processes throughout the project. Wear gloves as you handle items, be careful with items, and support artifacts from the bottom as you carry them. One of the best hints I can give you is to group similarly sized objects together. That will make the photography process go much smoother because you won't have to move the camera, the lights, the step stool, and the entire system between each photo. You'll want to take at least 2 photos of each object. At the bare minimum, you'll take 1 photo of just the object, and then take 1 photo of the object with that scale for size. And also, next to the scale, I recommend you have a whiteboard where you can write the accession number so that you can track what the photo or what the object in the photo is. And then this will help when your future colleagues look at the photos to make sure they know what they're looking at. You will also want to review and rename images at the end of each day. I cannot emphasize this enough. It is not helpful at the end of a project if you have thousands of photos titled DSC_number or 4digits.jpg. You may think you will remember what each item is, but trust me, I've taken a lot of pictures of bridges across this state, and eventually every open spandrel arch bridge starts to look very similar. Rename the photos so they're easier to refer back to. Your naming conventions may vary depending on your institution, but at the very least, you could rename photos with accession numbers. That would actually be a really great way to rename photos because you'd know what they each are, and it would be easy to refer back to. So now that we've discussed how to take object photos, I want to share a few examples. This object is one of my favorite items in the collection at the State Historical Museum of Iowa. It is a sand art bottle made by Andrew Clemens of McGregor, Iowa. He collected naturally colored sand from the bluffs along the Mississippi and dried and arranged the sand into beautiful pictures. You can see these are the photos for public consumption because there is no accession number and no scale in the photo. But there is two images, one of the front and one of the back, where you can see the details of the object. This is also a great example of how photos can provide better access to a collection. The Andrew Clemens sand art bottles are over 100 years old and very fragile. But by having images of them, they are more readily available for sharing. As you take these photos, you'll want to have multiple views. If something is taller than it is wide, take a vertical photo. And if something is wider than it is tall, take a horizontal photo. For three-dimensional objects, you'll want to shoot from slightly higher and looking down. That's something else the tripod or step stool could help with. As I mentioned before, you'll want to shoot at least 2 photos and take multiple photos to capture specific details or intricate designs. Don't forget inscriptions and labels. And remember, it's highly likely you're not shooting rolls of film anymore, so take as many pictures as you need. These are some examples of composition from the National Park Service. On the top row, you can see that curved background that I mentioned. And also, don't put the object right at the front of your photo area because it looks dangerous for the object, and also you won't have smooth background. Don't put it at the back because you'll have too much foreground. Put the object in the center. And then on the bottom, you can see an example of the scale and accession number. You want it near the item, but not directly in front of the item. And fill the frame, but not too much, as you can see on the left. You want to have a little bit of background in case you need to crop the photo for a usage. And once again, you need enough room to put the scale and accession number not right in front of the object. And as you can see on the right, you don't want the object to drown. There is a happy medium right in the middle. Use this example as you are taking your own object photos. So where to store the photos? Once you've got the first 2 big check marks of take great object photos and renamed object photos, where do you put those photos? Where do we keep them so they're safe? This is a situation where duplication is good. There are many, many options. You can keep the photos on the device where they were originally taken. That's probably not the best idea because it's hard to impossible to rename photos that way. You can transfer the photos to a computer tower or an external hard drive. External hard drives keep going down in price every year. And there is also cloud photo storage. Both Amazon Photos and Google Photos are fairly nimble to work with. Each year I pay about $30 for my personal Google Photos storage, and Amazon Photos is unlimited with an Amazon Prime subscription. It's important to keep your photos in more than one place, and I would recommend that if you don't use the cloud photo storage solutions, but use your computer tower with everything copied to an external hard drive, take the external hard drive to a different location so that it is safe if something would happen to the building where your computer tower and collection are located. It's one of the reasons you spent all this time doing object photography, so you can have a record of the collection. So keep those pictures in a different location. Duplication is good, and 20 years ago, I would have cautioned you about the digital photo storage. I'm no expert, but it seems like we have reached a time where JPEGs are a pretty usable, pretty transferable photo format, but it's something that you want to keep up on and follow the latest research, because you also don't want to spend 6 months photographing 1,000 items and not be able to see the photos in 10 years. It's not a bad idea to get your photos printed either. So once you've done all your object photography, it's a great way to increase your access to your collections. This image is a screen grab from the State Historical Museum of Iowa collection. It's a Votes for Women hand fan from the Women's Suffrage Campaign, especially timely as we are currently celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment. You can see there's a brief description about the hand fan in the collection. More details, the size is listed, and also there's 2 images to show details of the hand fan. And then the next example is something that I just ran across last week and thought was especially relevant to share today. This image is hardened butter from the steamship Bertrand cargo. The Bertrand sank in the Missouri River, and many objects from the Bertrand, many artifacts, are on display at the DeSoto and Boyer Chute National Wildlife Refuge. They also have objects not on display in their collection, and they share many on social media. As I was scrolling Facebook and saw this photo, it immediately caught my eye because it's a decent photo of an object. And in the back, you can see the scale and accession number. I think that this is certainly evidence that the DeSoto and Boyer Chute National Wildlife Refuge did some object photography before the pandemic, and because they did, they now have content to share on social media. So this is just a great reminder that it's a good idea to do object photography as it helps create access to your collection. So are there financial resources available for this, Jess? Yes, there are. And the first 2 that I thought of are from the State Historical Society of Iowa Historic Resource Development Program, or HRDP grants. There are documentary collections grants that can be used for formatting alternatives or processing collections, and also museum funds available for cataloging or equipment, supplies, and facilities related to artifact preservation. It really depends how you frame your object photography project, which one of these categories would be better. But HRDP funds are always competitive, but they're there, and it's worth remembering that they exist. There are several online resources. Many thanks that I use them for this presentation, but you may also want to refer to them if you take on an object photography presentation. The Collections Trust UK was helpful. And I also need to thank my colleague Kay Coates, as she was an invaluable resource. I also found great resources from the Museum Textile Services, the Museums Plus Heritage Advisor, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the U.S. Department of Commerce, their case study from 2011. And I referred to the National Park Service Museum Handbook. It is 20 years old, and we're not using film anymore, but many of the things that they talked about were still very relevant. Recommend you check out any of those resources if you're looking for more information for an object photography presentation. And finally, if you are looking to reach out directly, my name is Jessica Rundlet. You can reach me at the State Historical Museum of Iowa via email or via telephone. If you have specific questions about object photography, my colleague Kay Coates, the State Historical Museum of Iowa Collections Coordinator, is a great resource. And if you're curious about those financial resources, I encourage you to connect with Kristen Vandermolen at the State Historical Society of Iowa. She is the grants manager and can provide more information than I ever could about those HRDP grants. Thank you very much for your time this morning. I'll be happy to take questions now.
Well, that was great, Jess. Thank you very much. Lots of really interesting information there, and I'm not a photography guy, but I found it fascinating. So good job, I guess is what I'm saying. We do have some questions that have come in. I was trying really hard to come up with a question related to hardened butter, but I just couldn't get there. So you won't have one of those today. First question that came through asks, are there any special suggestions of various photos needed for quilts?
I think quilts, especially bed-sized quilts rather than smaller or potentially smaller art quilts. I think quilts are something you definitely need a large space. There are challenges if you try to photograph them vertically, challenges with keeping them nice and square, but that certainly can be done depending on the hanging system that you have. If you have a large flat space, and I think you would need like a large scaffold to crawl above them, it would take quite the rigging system to photograph a quilt in a flat state. But if you wrote down Jody Evans' email address earlier during her presentation, Jody is an expert on quilts and textiles and would encourage you to reach out to her if you have questions about quilts, or perhaps other quilt-specific institutions.
Great. A comment came through, a piece of advice, which I think is a great piece of advice. Save images as TIFFs or PNGs to preserve digital quality of the image. JPEG files lose quality every time they're moved or edited. So I guess that's just, research your file formats and make sure you're choosing the right one to save it in, kind of like you spoke about for the long-term preservation of those digital files. Next question, good questions coming in, guys. Thanks very much. What are pertinent photos to take of multi-page objects? Like for a scrapbook, the cover and photograph every page, or what about something like a rural school book, the cover and just some representative pages? What would you suggest?
I think it depends how much unique information is on each page and how you will use the object to tell a story. I'm probably of the more is better camp because I'm also a bad luck person, that the one page I wouldn't photograph is the one that I would need. So I would encourage you to take photos of every page if they all have unique information.
That's great. How do you choose the color of the background? Is there a standard color, or is it just whatever makes the object look or show the best?
Between the choices of black, white, and gray, you can choose the one that makes the object show the best.
So don't use the virtual Zoom background to make it look like your object is vacationing in Aruba.
I would probably not recommend that.
Probably not that. Okay. You touched on it a little bit. Well, not a little bit. You had an entire slide of it. But I'm just wondering, as you learned about this, did you find some favorite resources for learning about those industry best practices that you'd like to share with the group?
My favorite resources are the ones that I listed on the slide. The museum textiles, was it Museum Plus Heritage? And the PDF of the National Park Service Museum Handbook that I found, even though it was 20 years old, I thought a lot of the content was really good. But I would encourage anyone to refer back to those resources listed. And I believe it was the Collections Trust from the UK. They had a really good, about 8-minute YouTube video.
That's great. Question about your preference. Do you prefer photographing a document rather than scanning it? If scanning a document, what settings do you recommend?
That is a question that I think I would defer to my colleague Becky Plunkett on. She's been mentioned in every session of this lightning round. Becky is our special collections person. But I think that it would depend on how fragile the document was, because there's just some things we don't want to fully crack open with the spine to scan, but there are scanners that work from above. And when you're photographing something, you certainly have the option to prop it up, so it's not as hard on the object.
One thing I wondered about as you were speaking, you know, you mentioned about kind of the improvements in cell phone technology, and whereas several years ago it wouldn't have been good to use a phone, and now there are some very high quality cameras in cell phones. Are you aware of any organizations that are supplementing their object photography with something like a 3D scanner to get a digital model of the object? I've been watching a lot of How It's Made with my 7-year-old, so that's where that question comes from.
So I have seen where some institutions are using 3D printers to create objects that people can touch to better experience them. So short answer is, I'm not sure, but that would be really cool.
That would be cool. Cool. And then unless a final question comes through for you, Jess, I was just wondering, you know, as you learned about how to photograph objects, can you identify any, like your number one kind of lesson learned about the whole thing, even if it's just your philosophy of object photography?
I think the number one lesson is lighting. Make sure you have good balanced lighting on the object, because the better lighting you start with, the better photo that you end.
That's great. Thanks. So we have about 8 minutes left with our scheduled time. I'd like to open up the floor to the viewers if you have a question for any of our presenters today. This is a little bit of a grab bag, or presenters, if you have any questions for any of your peers that came up while we were watching, this would be a good time to ask those questions. I think it's been really interesting information shared. I'll wait for a minute to see if anything comes through. If not, all right. Well, I'm gonna do the countdown. I'm gonna do a going, going, gone. Lots of thanks coming through in the comments section, and those are much appreciated. You know, hopefully I speak for my colleagues when I say that I know we worked hard on this presentation. So hopefully it's been interesting and enjoyable to all of you as well. So. I don't see questions coming through. That's okay. So we're at the end of our time for this session. Again, thank you to our presenters and for their sharing their expertise, and thanks to all of you who have viewed. I think we got up to 102 or 104 participants in this Zoom webinar, so that's incredible. It really makes us feel great. So thanks to everyone.